where NATO and NATO nations show resolve, Putin, he might use words, but he backs off. So the US administration's kind of stated concern that using these weapons to strike into Russia might somehow lead to escalation and NATO being drawn into the conflict. I'm afraid I just don't buy that. The evidence says otherwise.
What's your current analysis of the situation in Ukraine at the moment?
Well, I mean, it hasn't been the easiest few months for Ukraine. We have seen, where in the early part of last year, the Ukrainians very much had the initiative, and slowly that was ceded, and much of last year was a kind of pretty bloody stalemate. But there is little doubt that in recent months, the Russians have just started to gain the upper hand, not at a kind of really decisive manner. If you look at the gains the Russians are making, they're still very small. Hundreds of meters here and there. So we shouldn't overplay it, but the gains, such as they are coming on the Russian side at the moment. I guess the most significant thing recently has been the Russians opening up what you might call another axis in from the north down towards Kharkiv. Again, very small gains, but it's not necessarily about the gains. It's about the pressure it places the Ukrainians on, not just politically, but also in terms of pulling their reserves from other areas to defend against that advance.
We saw that the US sent their aid package to Ukraine. Ukraine is receiving weapons from that as well. Do you say that that's having any impact in terms of Ukraine's defense against the Russian offensive?
Well, we hear that, President Zelensky says that, some of the lead elements of that aid package is now beginning to flow into Ukraine. But inevitably, there is a long lead time from the declaration of a very significant aid package to it having a decisive effect on the battlefield. Now, the Americans were very quick on the mark, and they made great play of this, that as soon as the President Biden made the announcement that the first elements started moving, the first pieces of ammunition, etc., started flowing. But that is almost tokenistic. It's to demonstrate, early movement. But to, get the substance of that aid package into Ukraine, into the hands of the Ukrainian warfighters, integrated into warfighting capability, inevitably takes time. Now, others will be closer to this than me, but my sense would be you're talking about next year before all of that aid. Sweden have just made another significant pledge. It takes a significant amount of time for that kind of that to turn into real military hardware that can be fought effectively. And if I can just use if we think back to the spring of last year, and everyone's very excited about the much vaunted spring offensive the Ukrainians were going to make. And people were surprised that all this aid that the West had given wasn't kind of ready. And of course, the reason it wasn't ready was that the Western nations prevaricated about provided it too late. And there simply wasn't the time for the Ukrainians to integrate the equipment in the way that they needed to into coherent fighting forces, and in that case they had months, but it still wasn't long enough. So this huge aid budget from America is incredibly significant, but let's not kid ourselves. The significant delay in Washington has a real impact on the battlefield for President Zelensky and his military.
The US says that it will keep its ban on Ukraine using American weapons to strike military targets in Russia, for example. What's your analysis of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know what the politics is behind that, and I wouldn't wish to second guess. President Biden faces all sorts of pressures in Washington that unless you're inside the administration, it's hard to know what those are. All I can tell you is from a military perspective and from a strategic perspective, it seems peculiar. We're well over 2 years into this war. We know from experience that Putin's threats are tending not to manifest themselves. where NATO and NATO nations show resolve, Putin, he might use words, but he backs off. So the US administration's kind of stated concern that using these weapons to strike into Russia might somehow lead to escalation and NATO being drawn into the conflict. I'm afraid I just don't buy that. The evidence says otherwise. Now, none of us have got a crystal ball. That might be the case, but the evidence would suggest it's not. And so I think it's a very peculiar decision to stick with this. I think about 10 nations, including the United Kingdom, have said that they would be entirely happy for our donored equipment to be used to strike into Russia. The Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, has said he thinks nations should do that. So why America is holding back is really hard to divine. What I can tell you is the only winner from them doing that is President Putin and Russia, because firstly, it allows Putin to prise open the alliance, demonstrate lack of unity amongst nations, but for Zelensky and his forces, who are fighting the most incredibly difficult war, we're just tying their hand yet further behind their back. Why would Zelensky not strike into Russia when he has been struck from inside Russia? I mean, this isn't Queensberry rules. This is war, and you fight by the rules of war, and we continue to kind of somehow judge the Ukrainians for their lack of success on the battlefield, rather than looking inwards and asking ourselves, they're fighting on our behalf, and are we doing enough to back them? And for me, this is a really clear example of where we're simply not backing Ukraine. As I say, I don't second guess Washington politics. There may be very good reason for it, but I tell you clear as day, from a military and a grand strategic point of view, there are very, very negative consequences to that decision coming out of Washington. Now, I should say there are some suggestions coming out of Secretary Blinken that they might shift their position over time. I think he's talking about, adapting, they've adapted their policy over time, and perhaps that's just giving a little bit of daylight on this issue. Well, I really hope they take that forward.
Do you think that there could be change? You mentioned Antony Blinken trying to lobby for change, but if you could put some sort of scale on it, how likely do you think that would be?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Again, I mean, these things are really hard to predict, aren't they? Because we'll seek to divine comments by spokespeople, by secretaries, and the like. The reality is we don't know. It could be really quite soon. It could be that Blinken manages to persuade President Biden quite quickly and a change is made. Equally, we know some decisions coming out of Washington have taken a very, very long time to come to bear. The decision to provide F-16 fast jets, for example, the decision to provide main battle tanks. America did not lead that conversation. Britain did. Why did Britain agree to provide, I think it was 14 Challenger 2 tanks? It wasn't about the Challenger 2 tanks. What the Ukrainians wanted was the German tank, Leopard 2, because they're very readily available across Europe. You get commonality of tank. The reason Britain did it was to demonstrate leadership, so that, if we offer to provide tanks, then we're the first to go and other nations come in behind. America has found it quite hard to take some of those steps. So, it's really hard to answer your question. But there is some evidence to suggest what you might call no-brainer decisions have taken Washington quite a long time to get to.
We heard from Vladimir Putin. He did say on Tuesday that attacks by Ukraine on Russian territories of Western missiles, that this could trigger a new world war. But as you mentioned, Putin is no stranger to making claims without any substance to them. But we have seen that Russia, they did begin nuclear drills near to Ukraine. Do you see this as any sort of advance with these threats, or do you think they still remain to be baseless?
I think they're baseless. he's thrown around threats about nuclear weapons pretty much throughout the conflict. To me, that they're just words. Now, you need the intelligence community need to still, be doing what they do brilliantly, watching like hawks to see whether there's evidence that they're more than words. President Putin, historically, all the way back in time, he's an opportunist. Why did he invade Ukraine 2 and a bit years ago? He did so because when he went into Crimea in 2014-15, the West did nothing. So he concluded there was opportunity. To be fair, since the invasion 2 and a bit years ago, NATO and nations have done a reasonable job of demonstrating that there is no opportunity for Putin to further exploit into NATO and other nations. And so he can keep using these words, but I don't think they're backed up by action. Yes, everyone's rightly points to these nuclear drills. Russia conducts nuclear drills. If you have capabilities, you have to conduct drills, and you can use drill as messaging. There's a big NATO exercise going on in Lithuania at the moment. That's about messaging. Of course, it's about military capability as well, but fundamentally, it's about demonstrating to Russia that NATO is unified and to deter any opportunistic move by President Putin.
We also saw that the Biden administration, they've stepped up warnings about China's support for Russia with threats of sanctions, for example. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that's right. You need to be putting as much sanction pressure on Russia and Russia's sponsors and supporters as possible. The sad reality is that sanctions are not terribly effective. Any economist will be able to tell you far better than I can the limited effect that sanctions have had on Russia during the course of the war. And so I'm not saying you don't apply the sanctions. They're important. They're important politically. But the real impact they have, I think, is a moot point.
We've got the US general election coming up. How do you think that could change if we have someone else coming in, for example, Donald Trump? How could that shift relations?
Well, I guess it creates unpredictability, doesn't it? If President Biden gets in for another term, we know pretty much what we're going to get. He has been a supporter of Ukraine. And as despite, in the detail, one might wish him to do slightly different things, but fundamentally, the US has been a strong supporter of Ukraine through this. President Trump is known for one thing, and that is unpredictability. He has grandiose views about his ability to make things happen on the world stage, absolutely not backed up by evidence from his first term. He simplifies extremely complicated situations. His slogan about "Make America Great Again," isolationism. What we don't know is what to the degree to which in a second term those would continue to be where the substance would be, if you like. But I think the one thing we can be certain of is when he comes into office, will be uncertain. He is unpredictable, and what President Zelensky needs is certainty. What Putin needs is he needs to know his adversary. From our point of view, he needs to know his adversaries are united. What NATO needs is confidence that the Americans stay in lockstep in the defense of Europe and in the defense of Ukraine.
Rupert Jones, thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure, Joe.